land access and land tenure, my work is primarily in Brazil, and also I do a lot of work here in British Columbia. And this project that we're going to be talking about today is part of a larger multi-year research project looking at alternative models of agrarian reform, land access, and community farms in Brazil and BC. Jessica Dennis is a master's student here at LFS working with us on this project, and the content of our webinar today is primarily the result of her thesis research over the last year. This research has been supported by the Real Estate Foundation and also by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. I'll talk a little bit about the history of this project before I hand it over to Dennis. So 4 or 5 years ago, I was visiting with Heather Pritchard from Farm Folk City Folk and Ramona Scott from the Land Conservancy of BC, who had come together as two organizations in BC working to facilitate land access for new and beginning farmers and for people who were facing challenges in acquiring land for farming. So these tended to be farmers not coming from the traditional farming sector. They weren't inheriting land. They might have been former urban residents going through apprenticeship programs, trying to figure out ways to access land in different models than through the open market. So we initiated a survey of a variety of community farms in 2009, about 20 different farms across the province that are using cooperative and land sharing models. We put out some reports on that. Those are available at communityfarms.ca website. We've taken up that research again this year to see how those farms are doing and also to look at new models of land sharing. And then additionally, Dennis is going to report on a survey that she has conducted with prospective people who want to acquire land for farming in the province.
Thank you, Hannah, for the introduction. So I'm here today to talk about planning for farmland access in British Columbia and the research I've done for my master's thesis. Hannah already mentioned that we've been funded partially by the Real Estate Foundation for this research, as well as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I'd like to thank our partners, the UBC Centre for Sustainable Food Systems, Farm Folk City Folk, Young Agrarians, and thanks to the Learning Centre at UBC for helping us with the tech support for this webinar. And also a really big thank you to all those who have participated in the research that I've done. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to just briefly talk about the challenges around farmland access in BC, discuss some growing, beginning, and young farmer movements and networks, and talk about the survey that I've done with prospective farmers, and then move on to talk about some of the alternative models we've looked at and some recommendations for the future. And so just for a brief starting point, just to make the link between farmland access and food security and food sovereignty in BC. The reason that we're doing this research and that many people are doing this work is that the protection of farmland and farmland that's actively farmed is fundamental to food security in the province, and also to food sovereignty. And for those of you unfamiliar with the term food sovereignty, it's referring to the ability, people's right to assert and control and define their own food systems. And fundamental to that is being able to have control over the productive resource base, and that includes land. So I see the protection of land and the access to that land is fundamental to food sovereignty. So I'll just briefly touch on some of these challenges that we face here in BC. I think many of you are familiar with these, so I won't dwell. We have one of the big problems is the loss of farmland or reduced capability in the land that we do have as a result of ALR exclusions. And there's many documented cases of this since the ALR was formed. And then the high cost of farmland makes farmland largely inaccessible to many farmers. This is sort of driven by non-farm uses, speculation, and is really problematic in terms of declining profit margins, increasing cost of land, and increasing debt in the province. Lastly, and there's large amounts of underutilized land. So this has also been well documented, and these numbers I have up are from the ALR from the ALC website. So how much land is in the agricultural land reserve, and then the second number at the bottom is the total amount of land that's being farmed according to the 2011 census from Statistics Canada. And you can see that the amount of land in the reported to be in the ALR is about double that which is actually being reported to be actively farmed. And you can see, so there's an issue here with farmland that's not being farmed. So I thought I'd start with a few quotes from prospective farmers from the survey that I did, just to emphasize these issues. The cost of land is by far the number one issue, and this was repeated by many of the people I've talked to over and over. Another person said, the cost of land and the cost of startup is prohibitive, and I'm not willing to take on that level of debt. So again, just emphasizing the challenges with debt. And the last quote, with the extremely high cost of land, hard work, and low income in farming, it's nearly impossible to farm in the BC region. Farming in BC is now for the rich, old, inherited people. Everyone else can only hope to rent, be subordinate to the owner. And so I thought that quote just highlights the issues with land rental and not being an ideal means for accessing farmland for everyone. And here we have, so I have a graph up showing the trends towards increased renting in British Columbia. And so this is data from the 2011 census again. And we see it starts from 1991 up to 2011. And we see that there's a decline in the amount of farmland that's owned by farm operators, and an increase in the amount of land that's being rented by farm operators. And so this is driven by the various challenges that farmers, especially the cost of land that farmers face in accessing land. And I think this is, while renting can be an agreement that works, it is also, I think this is indicative of a problematic trend with farmland access in the province. Another trend I just wanted to mention is that of declining young farmers. And so this has been in the news quite a bit recently. And again, I have the data from Statistics Canada up here from the last 2011 census. And we see there's been from 1991 to 2011, there's been a decline in farmers under 35 and an increase in farmers over 55. And so we see a steady trend in an increasing average age of farmers in the province. And that's reflective in the rest of Canada as well as in the US. We see the same trend happening. So I want to make the connection between the farmland access piece and looking at beginning farmers and new farmers. So here, a quote from the American Farmland Trust says that, "is not farmland without farmers." And I have a second quote from a farmer in Richmond. This was on a farmland protection panel. And she said, "the best way to protect our farmland is to farm it." And many people have articulated that, and that's sort of, if we need to protect farmland, we need to have people on it making a livelihood on that land. So the two pieces go together, and we can't address one without the other. And so despite the sort of dire picture presented by Stats Canada, we see sort of an emergence of what I've called beginning and young farmer movements. And one of I think the earlier ones and with the biggest network is the Greenhorns in the United States. And it was formed in 2007 and it has a membership of over 3,000 young farmers. Another one from the US is the National Young Farmers Coalition. And it started in 2009 to support young farmers. And then here in BC we have the BC Young Farmers Forum. There's also, this is a provincial chapter of a federal or a nationwide initiative to support young farmers. And their membership I spoke with someone and they estimated the membership in the range of 500 farmers in BC. Another one from Canada is Farm Start Ontario that has many initiatives to support young farmers and new entrants to agriculture, not just young farmers. And then in BC again we have the Young Agrarians, which is relatively new and has really flourished over the past few years. Their networks have dramatically increased and they have many events across the province that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And so I think this paints a more optimistic picture in terms of there is this growing momentum and interest in farming and accessing land, despite the stats from Statistics Canada. And so I want to look more into these new farmer networks and who they are and sort of learn more about these emerging young farmers. And so I did a bit of background research before I get into my survey. There's a survey in the United States of beginning young farmers, and they identified access to capital and land availability and cost of land as the primary challenges of beginning and young farmers. And then in terms of resources, both the US survey as well as some research surveys carried out in Ontario by Farm Start identified land linking, farm transfer support, and resources and tenure options as valued resources by farmers to overcome the land access barriers. And from the US survey, the most needed action was incentives for landowners to sell or rent land. And I think that's also reflected here in BC, that there's a big need for having a mechanism to have land transferred from outgoing farmers to new upcoming farmers who don't have a relationship to the land. And so I wanted to gather some data about what is happening here in British Columbia. And we did a survey geared towards beginning young farmers and prospective farmers. And so some of the questions we want to answer is, or partially answer is, who's accessing land and for what, where people want to access land, what barriers they face, resources they're using, and the type of land access that they're looking for. So I'm going to go through some of the findings from the survey. So the survey was open. It was distributed through various networks such as the Young Agrarians, Community Futures based out of Prince George, the BCYF. So I had help with networks who are organizations who have networks of young farmers to get responses to this survey. And it was open to anyone to respond to. And so this was there was 3 streams, either for current farmers, prospective farmers, which was defined as people who want to farm, who want to become a farm operator and access land in the next 5 years. And the people who don't intend to farm, who are involved with these networks. And so of the respondents, 43% were prospective farmers and 35% were current farmers. So quite a large part of the people who were responding from these networks are people who are either farming or wanting to farm. And of the people who don't intend to farm in the next 5 years, nearly half of them said they were considering farming in the future. So a little bit about the demographics of who this survey data is actually representing. So of the current farmers, 48% of them were under 35. And of the prospective farmers, 72% were under 35. So it is a significant amount of people that are what you would classify as young farmers. And then there was also people, the 35 to 44 range had quite a few, both current and prospective farmers. So again, emphasizing that prospective farmers and beginning farmers aren't necessarily young farmers. So when I say beginning and young farmers, it includes, by beginning I've used the definition of farming for less than 10 years, and young is under 35. So beginning and young farmer meets one of those. So you don't need to be young to be a beginning farmer. Important to recognize. And then just a little bit about, again, some more demographics. So I have a chart up here with the ethnicity of the respondents, and a large proportion identified as being Caucasian, white, or European, and Canadian. And I just want to point out that the demographics that we have here isn't representative of the cultural diversity present in BC's agricultural population. Nearly 20% of farmers in BC were born outside of Canada, and also the 70% of all respondents were female. So again, not representative of the gender distribution in the agricultural sector. So just to point out that the differences in who's represented here. And so a little bit about the question of who will be farming the land. So we have 82% of the prospective farmers and 67% of the beginning and young farmers were from non-farming backgrounds. And so there's this trend towards farmers who come from a non-farming family or non-farming background and want to get into farming. And this has also been reflected in the other surveys that the background research I did, both in Canada and the US. And this is a big piece in the farmland access research, because these farmers aren't going to be inheriting land or don't have family land to get started on. So the land access picture has a different dynamic for farmers coming from non-farming backgrounds compared to intergenerational farmers. And it seems like there's a rise in these non-farming background farmers. There's also, it seems to be, there's a large percentage of people coming from urban areas who want to get into farming. 38% of the prospective farmers were from Metro Vancouver. Most of the people had higher education. There was a lot of second career farmers. And most of the respondents had some sort of informal agricultural training or work experience already. And so another question we had was where prospective farmers want to farm. And so I have a map up here with And you see there's a predominance for people who want to farm on the Vancouver Island and South Coast and the Lower Mainland, as well as a significant chunk in the Kootenays and the Thompson Okanagan region, with lesser numbers of people wanting to farm in the more northern parts of the province. And this is again, so where are current beginning young farmers farming, and again, sort of same trends with more farmers in the southern part of the province. And going back to the prospective farmer locations, I just wanted to compare this with where there is agricultural land. And so we have here the hectares of ALR land in different regions. And you can see that we have huge amounts of agricultural land in the north, especially in the Peace River and the Caribou region. And I think it's worthwhile to note that where people want to farm isn't necessarily where the land is. So a few questions about practices on the land. Many of farmers were interested in small agriculture under 20 acres of land, and most of the 76% of the farmers who responded were currently farming less than 20 acres. Environmental stewardship was very important, as well as organic practices, though not necessarily certification. And there's definitely a large diversity of production and income streams that were represented. So I asked people to rate barriers, the significance of various barriers to entry into agriculture, as well as resources. And so it was rated on a 1 to 7 scale, from extremely significant to not significant at all. And so I've made the list here of the ones that were either extremely or very significant, just to point out the ones that are perceived to be the most significant barriers. And I just want to highlight some of the ones around land. So we see the top two, and this was reflected with the US survey that I mentioned earlier, the top two barriers are cost of land and lack of capital for prospective farmers. And then also, I want to point out, so I asked whether it was the appropriate type of farmland that is a barrier, or the current availability, or the actual lack of farmland. And you can see here that the lack of farmland is less of a barrier than the actual availability of land, or the availability of the appropriate type of farmland. And so again, most valued resources, the same thing, 1 to 7 scale. And so for prospective farmers, the top resource was alternative financing. And we also see loan programs for beginning young farmers was highly valued. And this matches well with the top barriers of what people prospective farmers need. Also interesting that there's a big trend towards, or an interest in these alternative financing mechanisms as opposed to the traditional loan mechanisms. And then again, pointing out the ones that have to do with land. So farmland protection programs were highly valued by prospective farmers as well as the current farmers. Land linking programs, and for those of you who aren't familiar, land linking programs are programs where landholders who have land that they aren't farming are linked with people who are looking for land, so sort of a matching system. And then land access resources, so that can be various resources like how to draft an access agreement or a lease, and how to approach landholders. And then again, and farm transfer and succession planning programs are also valued. I think it's interesting to point out that with valued resources, in terms of the training, it's the hands-on training in the farmer to mentoring program that is valued. That was clear in both the prospective and the current farmers. And I also want to point out recognizing some different challenges across demographics and geographic location. Because as I said, in terms of the demographics, a lot of these farmers are coming from non-farm backgrounds. So those farmers from farm backgrounds would likely have different primary concerns. It might not be farmland access. So with multi-generational young farmers, I think successional challenges and growing the business on a limited land base that you already have access to are bigger challenges than the actual potentially accessing new land. So just to acknowledge that there are differences amongst different demographics of beginning farmers, as well as the geographic location. So the land availability may not be as big a challenge in the more northern parts of the province as it is in the southern parts of the province. And there's different challenges such as the economics of the northern region and declining populations that are a challenge more so than that aren't a challenge of the lower mainland. So just to point out those differences exist. So I was going to transition back into the alternative tenure piece here, and to do that I want to sort of connect these four pieces of the puzzle. That we're not just conserving or protecting farmland, it's farmland and farmers. So I sort of see it as this interconnected circle of we need to protect the agricultural land base, support new and beginning farmers accessing that land base, which entails the land availability and access to that land, and then the last piece is the actual viability on the land. So we can't just, not just getting the people on the land. Once people have access to land, they actually need to be able to make a viable livelihood on the land if they're to continue farming and our agricultural land bases to continue to remain agricultural. And so there's all these components, and I'm focusing in on the land access piece and the new and beginning young farmers. So transitioning into the community farms and alternative land access piece. Hannah mentioned her work with the Community Farms program. And again, this is a program that began in 2006 as a collaboration between the Land Conservancy of BC and Farm Folk City Folk. And the definition that was developed of a community farm by the Community Farms Network is: a community farm is a multifunctional farm where the land is held in trust for community rather than owned privately. The community group or cooperative governs the land use agreements, and agricultural uses of the land are shared by a community of farmers. So it's quite a specific definition, and there aren't a lot of farms that necessarily fit into that particular definition. It sort of is something to strive towards for community farms. And so we sort of broaden the picture and looking more at shared farming on shared land. So that really sort of opens it up to a wider diversity of alternative ways, or what might be classified as sort of a community of farmers sharing and farming together on land, and how that's happening. And then also using the word alternative farmland tenure or alternative access. Again, looking at models other than the traditional private ownership and individual family farm enterprises, and what those are and how people are using them and why they're using them. And so we've developed a sort of topology of alternative farmland access, and this started from the initial research Hannah did documenting about 20 farms in 2009, and I built off of this with the documentation of the new farms that we've been interviewing and looking at currently. So I sort of separated into three different pieces, and that's the land ownership, so who actually owns the land access, so how farmers are getting on the land, and who's getting on the land, and then the management or operating arrangements once people are on the land. So then there's a whole diversity within these three categories, and you match them up in all different ways. So there's a huge diversity of models out there, and they all employ sort of different parts of this list matched up in different ways. So it's hard to sort of classify into specific categories. So I sort of like this, it's sort of like a choose your own adventure. If you pick one from each list, you can get a model that's out there. To clarify what these are, I'm going to go over some examples. So starting here with land ownership that is a cooperative. So this sort of is the initial community farm definition that Hannah was looking at and that I read out. So the land is owned, where the land is owned cooperatively, then it's accessed by farmers through a long-term lease. And I have two examples. So one of them is Porch Lake Farm near 100 Mile House. And in this case, the long-term lease is to a workers' cooperative. There's actually two separate legal cooperatives in this case. So one cooperative owns the land, and then there's the farming cooperative that has a lease to farm that land. And then the second case, Glen Valley in Abbotsford. In this case, again, it's a land cooperative and a long-term lease, but instead of to a cooperative of farmers, it's a long-term lease to individual farm enterprises. So these are nice examples where you can have cooperatively held land, both accessed by farmers farming together cooperatively, or independent businesses who are sharing land and resources but have independent farm businesses. So examples of public lands, so land held by the government. And I have a few different examples with different access and management models. So one of them is the Richmond Sharing Farm, as well as the Richmond Incubator Farm, so those are two different pieces of public land held in Richmond. So the Richmond Sharing Farm is governed by a nonprofit society, and the Incubator Farm has been, it was also managed by a nonprofit society. It's been handed over to the University of Farmland to run educational programs. And so in these cases, the access, so for the Incubator Farm, we have short-term leases to the incubator farmers. For the people who are familiar with the Incubator Farm, it's where farmers who are starting out are able to access land for a limited period of time to get started, and then they would move on. So it's usually 2 to 3, 2 to 5 years, depending on the model. And the Sharing Farm is run by a nonprofit society, and they have a hired farm operator, a manager, as well as various educational programs and people who volunteer and work on the land. So another example from Saanich is Haliburton Farm. It's public land, and it's managed by a nonprofit society, and then it's accessed by individual farmers who hold short-term leases. So the maximum is, the leases are 5 years. So again, it's sort of a starting out model, so farmers can have access to land for 5 years to build a business and their knowledge on the land. And another example is the Newman Farm, also in Saanich, in central Saanich. And so again, public land, and in this case it's being managed by the Farmland Trust Society, and they're a nonprofit society again. And so this was a relatively new agreement between the nonprofit society and the city. So when I had talked to them, they had developed exactly how the land was going to be accessed by the farmers and worked out those details. Another model is where the land is actually owned by the nonprofit society. And so an example of this is Sendon, the Agriculture and Resource Centre in Hazelton, BC. It's near Smithers. And so this is an example where a nonprofit society purchased farmland. So it's owned by the society, and it's accessed by society members and the participants of programs led by the nonprofit society. And in this case, it's they do job training and skills training, land-based on the agricultural land. Another example on Vancouver Island in Duncan is Glenora Farm. So again, it's owned by the society, nonprofit society, managed by a nonprofit society, and in this case, they provide a place to live and work for people with developmental disabilities. And so people on the land are society members and program participants, and they also have a hired farm manager, but the people living there contribute to the farming as well. And moving on to land trusts. So land trusts are also a nonprofit society, but with a specific focus on holding land or holding covenants on land. And so an example of this is Majona Farm in Saanich, where the land is held by a nonprofit society and it's accessed through a long-term lease to a farm operator. In the case of Majona, it's an individual farm enterprise. And then the second example is Keating Farm, also on Vancouver Island. And this is an interesting example because the Keating Farm is currently up for sale, or I'm not sure if it's been sold or not, but this is a recent news article that the Keating Farm can be sold as land sort of grapples with debt. So I just wanted to, as we were talking about land trust, talk about the Land Conservancy of BC. And so they have major debt and have had their assets frozen by the CRA, and are working to overcome that. And so this is problematic and raises a lot of questions about how land trusts work and whether it's actually an effective strategy for holding land over in perpetuity as they're supposed to, especially with the example of Keating Farm being up for sale. I'm going to talk a little bit more about farmland trusts later, but just for the Keating example, in this example, the land was held by a land trust and it was leased to a cooperative. And a big problem that was faced was there was a mortgage on the land, so they weren't able to finance the land up front. And this mortgage, they tried to sell shares by the cooperative, to create a cooperative, and to finance the land, but they didn't sell enough shares, and so the cooperative ended up holding debt. And this prevented the cooperative from successfully moving forward and establishing what could have been on that land. And so that, I think that's a big learning lesson, is not to Cooperatives shouldn't be forming cooperatives in which members enter and have debt, and also that having going to a land trust, not taking out mortgages on more land that you can pay. And covenants are one way that I'll mention a little bit, but of doing that without having to actually acquire the land and pay the cost of the land and hold debt and mortgage. So the last example here is where the land is owned privately. And then there's, again, various access and management mechanisms. And so one example here from the Slocan Valley. So it's a private landholder, and then it's being informally accessed by a group of farmers. So there's various families living on the land, but they're not formally a cooperative, and they don't have a formal arrangement. So it's sort of, but they did mention that they are interested in becoming more formalized. But this is an example of a private land and an informal access arrangement. Another example is Green City Acres in Kelowna, and this is a model where, again, it's mostly informal or handshake agreements or memorandums of understanding in which the farmers are accessing often residential lands to farm it. And so there's many examples of this in Vancouver and many other places in the province, Victoria and others in Kelowna and Nelson. Here's another example from Rossland. Gravity Farm, again, access various properties, often just on handshake agreements. And so the land is privately held, and this enables farmers to access without having to invest. But there's lots of challenges that come along with these types of agreements. Landholders can pull out at any time or make demands of you that might not be fair. So I'm just going to reiterate some of what the motivations and benefits for these types of agreements are. A big one is the shared cost of land, and these access agreements being a means to access for people who can't afford farmland. Shared resources, and this is a really big one, many people who are in shared land access agreements have mentioned that this is not just the land, but it's the resources on the land, so the equipment you're using, the irrigation, the drainage, so it really reduces the capital costs of startup. And again, shared knowledge and mentoring is a really big, a really great importance to those using these models. The ability to farm with other people as you're starting up is a huge asset to beginning farmers and new farmers. Some of these models, like the land trusts or the cooperatives, are means of holding farmland and protecting farmland by the community. And another one is non-family intergenerational farming, and that relates back to the mentoring. But for young people who don't have farm families, entering into these community farms is appealing, in that you can have intergenerational relationships with farmers on the land. And then the potential for not having debt. So carrying debt as a young farmer can be very, very challenging, and so many people want to avoid that, and that's I think a big driver of why people are using these agreements. And then many of these farms have mandates beyond just production, and so you see an integration of agriculture and other social mandates, both on the farm and off the farm. And so there's benefits beyond the production and beyond the farm itself. But of course they come with challenges, and again, there's many challenges that I've heard from the people I've spoken with, and just to highlight a few here. Some of these, like the formal cooperatives, there's complex legal, financial, and governance arrangements, and this can be a lot for people who don't have the knowledge to enter into these agreements, and it can be very time-consuming. And financing, again, so in some cases it doesn't actually address the issue of financing the land acquisition, like in the case of Keating Farm I mentioned. So it was an alternative mechanism, there was a co-op in place, but it still didn't overcome the barrier of the cost of that land and being able to hold the cost of that land. And so this is still a big issue, is how, even with these shared land access models and people wanting to hold land together and protect land, how can we actually finance the acquisition of that land? And then personal relationships between farmers and between the farmers on land and between farmers and landholders is probably the primary challenge I've heard from people using these models, whether it's a formal co-op and it's the dynamics within the co-op, or it's these informal agreements and the dynamics between the landholder and the farmer with the informal agreement. That it's both time-consuming, energy-consuming, and that this is it requires a lot of work. And again, along with that, the complicated decision making. So especially if you have a board, if you're working with a nonprofit society or with a co-op. So it's just an added on expenditure of your time as a farmer. And so some farmers, this isn't necessarily what they want to spend their time doing. And so it's just important to recognize that being involved with a structure like this involves both knowledge and understanding how they operate and your time to be involved with these decision-making processes. Then housing and zoning regulations are barriers to some of the shared land access models where people are living on the land. And then balancing privacy and independence on the farm. So there's this tension between wanting to access land and use these and farm together with people in community and cooperatively, but also being able to balance your privacy and your independence as a farmer. Many people get into farming because they want to be their own managers and bosses, and so if you enter into a cooperative agreement, it's something that you need to consider, and we need to recognize that these models aren't for everyone. And some of these alternative models do allow for sort of a cooperative land holding, for instance, but then the independence as the farm operator. And so I think there's a need for a whole diversity of models that meet the needs of people who want to be independent farm businesses. And so I can jump back to the survey that I did. And so one of the questions I want to look at as we research these alternative models was, well, what type of land access do prospective farmers actually want? Do people want to enter into these arrangements that we're looking at, these alternative models? And so ask prospective farmers what their top 3 land access arrangements were, what their ideal arrangement would be. And private ownership was the #1 choice, with the second choice being cooperative ownership, out of a range of agreements including short and long-term leases, crop share, and hired operator, and some others. So private ownership was the first choice. And then for both prospective farmers and the beginning and young current farmers, for those who were interested in having a lease or who currently had a lease they're farming, I asked if they hoped to own land in the future. And 100% of prospective farmers said yes, they hope to own land in the future, and 91% of beginning and young farmers who don't currently own land hope to own land in the future. And I didn't clarify whether that was individual or cooperative ownership. It was just owning land through some mechanism. And I also asked similar questions about operating arrangements. And for both prospective and current farmers, the individual or family farm was the most favored operating arrangement. And so I think this is important to note in terms of what it is that people want as we are looking at these alternative models that we're trying to support or advance, and ensuring that we're matching what people want and need to what we're developing. And so following the question on what ideal arrangement farmers wanted, I asked farmers to rate their willingness to engage in alternative land access models if they had the opportunity. And so there is, despite wanting to own their own farmland, there is a willingness to engage in these different models. And so again, I used a ranking system. And so for those who can see the slide, at the top of my list, I have the arrangements that had the highest level of willingness, and at the bottom where there's a low level of willingness to engage in. And so what I noticed here is, for those on the phone, so some of the examples at the top, the high level of willingness are farm transfer arrangement with a retiring farmer, cooperative ownership with farmers, lease from agricultural land trust, or cooperative ownership. So those were the top where there was the most willingness. And the least willingness were ones such as crop share, access from residential landowners, hired farm operator. And so what you see is that where there's a high level of willingness are the agreements that have a high level of tenure security. Where there's a low level of willingness is those with low level of security, so the unstable relationships. And so this reflects, again, that farmers want long-term security on the land, even if they're using these alternative mechanisms. And again, same thing with the attitudes towards operating arrangements. I had them rate their willingness to engage in different types of arrangements, sort of focusing on what would be sort of different shared arrangements. And so as I mentioned, so individual or family farm is at the top of the list in terms of willingness. And then some of the ones at the bottom where there's a low level of willingness are hired farm operator, informal cooperatives, and informal partnerships. Whereas formal cooperatives and formal partnerships had a high level of willingness. So again, you just see there's an element of people want stability in the operating arrangements as well. So informal operating arrangements can work for people, but it seems that there's a tendency towards wanting a more formalized and stable arrangement on the land that you're accessing. In many of the farmers that I've spoken with, or the events that we've attended, you hear over and over farmers, especially sort of these young farmers starting out, that they don't think they're ever going to be able to access land, that ownership isn't even an option anymore. And so I think it's really interesting to note this sentiment that farmers, starting out farmers have, in comparison, but then the desire to have ownership in these stable models. So when I say reducing the gap between desire and reality, so understanding what farmers' realities are, why they're entering into these agreements, but then what their actual desires are for farming. So what farmers want versus what they're willing to accept and perceive as realistic. And I think one young farmer that I spoke with recently, she was discussed her leasing situation, and she was fully aware that it wasn't ideal when she entered into it. She was fully aware that it isn't ideal currently, and she's looking for something else and a way to access a more secure land access agreement, whether it's through shared model or owning land in the future. But what she said is that she can't afford to buy land, but she wants to farm now, and she can't wait forever. And waiting around is not going to increase her, get her on the land. And so I think that is also, again, a big reason why there's an emergence in these alternative models, many of which are unstable, is that farmers want to farm now, and they're going to go out and do it, and they come up with these sort of creative entry points into farming through these access arrangements. And I think this is great, and it's something we're sort of encouraging people to actually get out there and get on the land and do this. But over the long term, I think there is a need to look at long-term secure access and how we can facilitate that when we're talking about alternative arrangements and not just these sort of unstable temporary models. And also not to forget to address root problems creating barriers to land access. So when we're supporting farmers through these alternative arrangements, to also be looking at why the issues, the root causes, the cost of land, the speculation, the ALR exclusions, and so also addressing the root causes driving these emergence and issues that young farmers face, and not just supporting letting the land keep rising as we support these alternative models. Just some preliminary comments on what I've seen in terms of I think there is a growth in alternative land access, and as I mentioned earlier, the Stats Canada, there's a trend towards increased renting, but I also think there's been a trend towards an increase in these alternative models of accessing land. And from what I've seen here, we see there seems to be a big growth in the non-secure and informal arrangements, more so than some of the more formal arrangements, like the community farms or the cooperatives, where there is sort of stability, some sort of built-in stability to those arrangements. There's also a big growth in short-term arrangements for beginning farmers, which is great, like the incubator farms, the apprentices, or short-term leases on public land to get started. And I think that is something that is great and we should continue to support. But then there's the question of where next for those farmers. So after you've done your time on the incubator plot or short-term lease, 5-year lease, then how do you move on? So it does provide essential training and skills, and you can build your business if you're new farming in that area, but then you still have to approach the issue of accessing land once again. And so again, just to reiterate, I think there's a need for longer-term protection and access of farmland in BC, and looking to develop those models and putting effort and resources into that direction. And so one model that we've been looking at is farmland trusts. And so we're continuing research on that, as well as seeking community input into whether there's a desire or need to have such a provincial farmland trust or a larger regional farmland trust, and a trust specific to farmland as opposed to a trust that is going to deal with some farmland. We're interested in having one that has a mandate that is farmland. And so that's sort of one of the directions this research is going, is looking into that. And I'm just going to move into some sort of broader recommendations, for the Farmland Trust just being one of those. And these recommendations are don't include everything, but just to highlight some of them. So for the nonprofit sector, as I said, working on developing a farmland trust in conjunction with existing organizations and trusts and government. And along with that is best practices for affirmative agricultural covenants. And so an agricultural covenant or an easement is a legally binding agreement attached to the title of the land. And I'm interested in pursuing these. There's not a lot of them, and for farmers who are interested right now, there's not really organizations that hold these or have a lot of experience in holding affirmative agricultural covenants. There's lots of land trusts that work to do conservation and hold restrictive covenants. So by affirmative, I mean a covenant that would entail that the use of agricultural land must be actively farmed in some way. So it's affirming an activity rather than restricting an activity. And so this is a mechanism that it does require resources, but not the same financial resources that actually physically acquiring the land, owning the land by the land trust organization would require. And there is some expressed interest in this, and I think it just requires a lot of work and development to actually put it into practice still. Before I start, I want to say that the nonprofits that are doing the work right now are delivering successful programs, and that first and foremost we should continue to support those programs that are existing. There are lots of programs, and there's not a need for duplication, and I think that we should continue to support many programs that have emerged, like the Community Futures programs in Prince George, Young Agrarians, the BC Young Farmers. So, and I also asked farmers whether they felt they were sufficiently aware of the programs and resources, and a majority of them said no. And so I think there's lots of resources out there. It's how to get those to farmers is one of the big questions. And I also think there's a need to have increased collaboration between people doing work in different regions of the province, especially between the northern parts of the province and the southern parts of the province, and acknowledging that we have different challenges and that there's potential for collaboration there. Especially in terms of sort of garnering the interest that exists in urban areas like Vancouver and making people aware of the opportunities that exist in the northern parts of the province, and that there is agricultural land and agricultural communities and support mechanisms out there, and even maybe growing incubator farms out there would be great, and sort of being able to have that connection between even the university programs here and farmers out in other regions to sort of expand outside the lower mainland to get people out there. And for the land, I think land linking programs are great, and it's especially important to continue to link the land access agreement resources with that, so farmers can sort of know what they're getting into and have appropriate agreements. And then there's also been it's been articulated that there's a need for training cooperative approaches to farming and land access. So there's definitely an interest in this, but then a lot of people don't actually know that much about forming a cooperative. And so I think this is a skill that we have the BC Cooperative Association that has been worked with farm folk, city folk to date already, but something we can further foster is how to provide these resources for farmers who are interested in cooperative arrangements so they know how to do it effectively. So a few recommendations for municipal government: continuing with developing food policies and continuing with the development of official community plans and zoning to protect agricultural land. And one thing that's been raised by the participants I've worked with is the potential for community farm zoning. So I mentioned, housing can be a challenge. There's various challenges when you have groups of people sharing land, especially ALR land, with respect to it can be both municipal or ALR regulations. And so how to create regulations that would be favorable to having sort of increased housing to enable community farms, but also to prevent the negative impacts of such a regulation. And so one suggestion is to develop a community farm zoning that would sort of allow for community farming, but also have the mechanisms to prevent sort of negative impacts of allowing something like increased housing on farmland. And so there's various people who've already worked on that, and I think it's just an element of getting those together and creating a proposal that municipal governments can work with. And I think that municipal governments, like the Richmond model, where the land is held by, public land is held by the municipality and is managed by a nonprofit or by a university as an incubator farm, is a great model, and that it's something that can be put into practice in other regions and municipalities. And so lastly here, for the provincial government, I also want to emphasize that in working on these alternative mechanisms and models and advancing these, it is by no means a replacement of the agricultural land reserve, and I 100% support the agricultural land reserve and the continuity of it and strengthening of that policy. And these alternative models are meant to be in collaboration with the existing policy we have around the agricultural land protection. And so again, so to continue to strengthen the agricultural land reserve. And so in financing and loan mechanisms for non-ownership, whether this could also be directed towards the financial industry, but a big challenge, so for farmers who are starting up but don't own land, it can be challenging to get loans because you don't have you're not holding the land, you're not taking out a mortgage. So creating ways that people can access financing in non-ownership models. And then with respect to the ALR, there's a need to revise the regulations around housing for community farms. And again, as I already said, the zoning in a way that enables community farms without the negative impacts of housing on land. And the potential for sharing large ALR parcels if there's an increasing interest in small lot agriculture. And doing that with avoiding the problems of subdividing agricultural land. So if people want small lot agriculture in areas where there's only large parcels, how can we do that? How can we create that opportunity while not subdividing and still maintain the integrity of large agricultural parcels? Another need is support for non-family succession and intergenerational land transfer between non-family members. So there's lots of resources out there for succession and land transfer between family members. But when you have community farms or people who want to, outgoing farmers who don't have children to transfer land to, and incoming farmers that they can build relationships with, how can we support that? So that is just a matter of sort of tailoring some of the existing resources to non-family relationships and enabling that process. And another thing that's been mentioned by quite a few people is developing and promoting government cost sharing programs for internships. So for short-term accesses through internships and apprenticeships, having funding for that, so it's just not on the backs of farmers and interns who have to work for free. So having more formalized programs. And I know that there's some that have been out there, but further promoting that. And then just lastly, finishing up with sort of back to the land trust. We see integration with government as would be a great benefit in terms of the long-term sustainability of that. And so having government land banks in collaboration with emerging farmland trusts. And just one last finishing quote on the note of land trusts. So this is from Maura Quayle, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. And in a report to the Ministry of Agriculture, so she articulated, which I hope I emphasize in this presentation, that preservation and isolation will not be enough, for one. And then one of her recommendations was establish a BC Lands Trust with an umbrella trust for agriculture so that a percentage of the billions of dollars of intergenerational wealth in the province can be put to good use as citizens are encouraged to donate their land or their cash assets to the trust. And so this was in 1998. So again, I just want to point out that many of these ideas aren't new. There's lots of excellent ideas and recommendations that have been made. It's just an issue of sort of recognizing those and being able to collaborate and find means to put them into action. And so, thank you so much for listening. If people have some questions or comments or suggestions, or we are open the floor to people here and people on our webinar.
Thanks, Dennis. I'll moderate the discussion here, and I think maybe what we'll do is go back and forth between a web participant and an in-house participant. And I'd like to actually start with the web participants since they've been so patiently waiting. So if someone wants to jump in with a comment or a question, and make sure just to identify yourself with your name and your organization or where you are in the province would be help us to sort of put a face to the voice.
Marianne Johnson here. Can you hear me?
We can.
I have a farm in Souk and have been active with the Soil Apprenticeship Program. And we have a Souk Farmland Trust, which has started out and we're sort of taking my farm on as the sort of challenge to see how my farm can be transferred. But as you were talking, it seemed like one point I'd like to emphasize that's happened on my farm, and as I look around at older farmers around me who are having problems with succession, or with finding a way to transfer their land. It takes time to build trust between the landowner, who might be the farmer, and the group of people who would be likely to take over. That the apprenticeship, the soil internship or apprenticeship is a good start, but something needs to be done there to work out that building of trust between the farmer who is mentoring the people who are working with the farmer. 11 years ago, a young one, Marika, came to my program, to the soil program, and over the 10 years, we've developed a partnership with the business, and now I think it takes that long to build that kind of trust. The expectation that a person's just going to be able to access a farmer's land without, with any kind of any tenure, when the farmer has no sense of just how serious and capable the young person is, the new farmer. So I think there seems to be a need there in fostering that whole relationship. That's my comment.
Thank you, Mary Alice. Yeah, that's a great point, and that a lot, like in terms of the relationship building, that is something that is really challenging to sort of institutionally provide. But I think that is in terms of developing those long-term relationships, and also making both parties aware of the needs and that it takes time to build that, especially with young farmers who are just eager to get going. But emphasizing that building the relationship with the people you're working with on the land over time, it takes time and work. And yeah, thank you, Mary Alice.
Great. So maybe one of our in-house participants. Questions or comments? Andrew Reisman from UC.
I'm curious about the scaling and profitability dimensions to this situation. And if the goal is to have viability ultimately for these new farmers, or to create an atmosphere that allows for viability, how does that change? How does that atmosphere change depending if they're on a micro farm in some urban setting versus some small to mid-size operation, 20 acres? And then how do we factor in what a successful operation is besides what profitability would say? And whether that's any considerations, and whether there's a place for principal component analysis or something to look at these different dimensions and understand the composite of criteria that need to be in place that promotes success. So I'm not sure I'm not sure where the question is.
Well, I think I can comment. I mean, for the micro farmers is mid-size, it's so variable, but you get farms who, like Green City Acres, or there's just a speaker from Quebec who is here, who can make, on these micro farms on very, very small acreages, make more money than your average farmer in BC is making on 20 acres. And whether that's a replicable model, but I think that the profitability is very different in terms of the type of land access you have. And there is potential on very small farms to be able to be. But actually, it's kind of the land question is interesting in terms of I think one person, people say to get bigger and bigger, they say that's the bigger they got, the less profitable they got.
So it's like a U-shaped curve, potentially.
Yeah. I think it's just really diverse. I mean, you have the business model, which is variably profitable depending on what the business model is and what the production model is. And the land price is then a separate piece of that. Certain production practices require more land, and that often costs more. So often I think people are moving towards these small lot production models because they can access the land for that in a way that they can't access 50 to 100 acres for a dairy farm.
So we have any, can I just one follow-up?
Yeah.
So we have any sense of the difference in opinions amongst the farmers on what is successful versus what is profitable? Are they equating these two things? Or will they accept lower profitability and consider themselves successful for their livelihood or quality of life or some other aspect?
Not measurable. I don't have, in terms of, I definitely didn't ask farmers what they define as success in the survey. Yeah. In terms of interviews, I think it'll come out more, and I haven't done the full analysis of all my interview data.
We've done some of that, and I can even just speak out of context here. We've done this exact question in our Brazil work, but we're asking farmers using these shared and alternative land access models what they constitute as success. And so they sort of say a level of income, which is in Brazil is about double the minimum wage, is what they consider adequate income. They add on to that the food they produce on the farm that they're eating. They add on to that their housing and place to live. So, a double the minimum wage plus housing plus food actually amounts to a reasonable lifestyle in Brazil. I've found in the conversations I've had with alternative sort of forms of farmers in BC is people don't feel like they're successful. They feel like they might be achieving a lifestyle situation, but they often struggle to work off farm in the winter, to work an extra job consulting. They find that I've often have quotes like, I have to work to support my farming habit in these kind of alternative models, and I don't think that that's sustainable. So I think a lot more work needs to be done on the economic viability piece, because otherwise what you see is people running out. They farm for 5 years in these really unstable arrangements. They don't have a long-term secure lease. They can't really afford to invest in the capital costs of scaling up their business or scaling out their business, because they're working on the side and all these things. So I think that's really the next piece. Once the land access is secure, then how do you build a sustainable economic enterprise on top of that? It's trying to tease apart those two really important thorny issues, I think, in this area. So, somebody from the webinar.
Sarah Dent.
Sarah Dent. Hi, Sarah. Sarah Dent from the Young
Hi.
Agrarians.
Hi. Great review, Dennis. Great work. I've got little heart palpitations because I'm so excited about what you guys are saying. even though it's a little bit dismal too at the same time. I'm over on the left island. I just recovered from the Rockstar Farmer tour with Omar Camp 48. And we had about 450 people come out to hear him in workshop on his 1.5 acre, 140,000 per year, 45% profit margin operation in Quebec. And a couple things came out of that as we were going through the workshop. One is a $7 a day daycare in Quebec. And two, he was able to purchase his land, his 10 acres, for $700,000. So, my question for you, Dennis, is based on doing all of this work, are there 1 to 2 major things that you think that we could get behind as a group of nonprofits and organizations, businesses, etc., that would affect kind of positive land tenure down the road? Like, are there 1 to 2 major things? Like, what I think of is, what if we could get some of the AFLR out of speculative land valuation, and we could have multiple owners and multiple houses on ALR, allowing for collective mortgaging structures that would allow for that long-term ownership and joint investment into a business operation. But that's just based on what my not really research, but just sort of the last couple of years of work in the new farmer startup world. And so I'm curious if you've got a couple things that really extra stand out for you that you think maybe we could all sort of garner our energy around.
I was going to say, the list of recommendations yesterday was much longer. So we've already distilled quite a bit.
That's a great question, Sarah. And I think, as I've been going through, I had a long list of recommendations that need to be tailored into the answer to your question, because I think that's what we need is the 1 to 2 tangible, most important things that we can approach. I'm sort of hesitant to answer that right this second, and as I'm for everybody, this was the sort of first major presentation I've done with the results, and I'm going to write it up in a report format to share with everybody and all the networks that have participated, and we'll have a more distilled and articulate section on the recommendations and.
The results of the conversations that we've been having around the profit, it's not just us, but with the BC Food Systems Network, with Community Farms Program, is there's quite a bit of demand around the profits for a provincial trust. I mean, going back 15 years, TLC fulfilled that role for a short period of time. Its mandate was not farmland protection. It failed for reasons that don't necessarily have to do with farmland. So there's a lot of interest in actually trying to build a provincial public farmland trust. So there's people who are willing to donate their farms. There are municipal and public land is farmland that if it can be maintained in a provincial trust, it can be leased out. So I think there's a lot of interest in that. It's something that municipal governments can get their head around because some of them own farmland already, and it's just a matter of how do you actually facilitate the management of that land so that it's not a burden to the municipalities but rather an asset. So I think that's a really tangible thing that I think a number of organizations around the province are interested in and could work on together.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think in the agricultural covenants as well, I think there's interest in it, and we can look elsewhere where it is being widely used, and it can have the impact of reducing or ideally preventing land speculation and reducing the land values back down to agricultural values.
Right. So tax policy and affirmative agricultural covenants. So those are something that goes on the title of the land, such that if it's not actively farmed, then there's some kind of consequence. So either a higher rent, or you lose your access to it, or you pay a differential tax rate. We have that a little bit with farm tax status, but it's not a high enough differential it's not a high enough incentive to get landowners who aren't currently farming to put that land into production, especially if it's being used as a rural estate. So lots of little things like that, fiscal policy, tax policy, and then provincial farmland trust, I think would be my top recommendation.
Yes, and I think, and Sarah, I don't know if you clarified if you were looking for nonprofit, but I would say that in terms of what Hannah said, I think that we need to collaborate. The nonprofits need to collaborate with government and institutional mechanisms in order to enable the impact that we want to see. The nonprofits need to continue doing the amazing work that they are doing to support farmers, but I think there's, in terms of these big issues like land speculation and farmland trust, I think there's a real need to have some institutional support in order to have longevity and stability and appropriate resources for that to happen.
All right, so a question from the table, Brent, and then Teresa.
Kind of related to the provincial farmland trust, and I'm kind of wrapping my head around it. And I think what comes up to me kind of strategically in terms of developing models and advocating for good public policy is how, in moving forward with this idea, do we not replicate, in some ways, what food banks have been to food and income insecurity? How can we not replicate that with farmland trusts being to public policy on farmland protection? So if you get what I'm saying, kind of like we've seen food banks just as a parallel come in and advocate state responsibility and withdraw the state from caring for, right? So how do we make sure, and I think we're touching on it, but just wanted to tease that out a little bit so that we don't do the same thing where we can actually in some ways see a government who at this point seems quite open to removing public policy around farmland protection, see farmland trusts as a way to be like, great, charitable sector and financing, you guys will take care of it, and then we don't have to deal with it. I think it's something we're going to need to, with all the people around this table and others, walk into with eyes wide open as that relationship with government comes. So thoughts on that, and curious to know others' perspectives on the phone and here.
We're going to have a response from Teresa here.
Yeah, hi, Teresa from Metro Vancouver. This question about whether putting farmland in public ownership is the best way to protect it, that's come up.
Yeah.
Some of the local issues that are arising. But I think if a farmland trust takes on more of a wider role in terms of, like, one question I had was about the land linking. How much urgency is there amongst farmers to have that kind of service? We know there's Farm Start in Ontario. Is it carrying over here in British Columbia? Is there a real need for that kind of role? So if a Farmland Trust took on other things aside land ownership and not make land ownership in a trust form be the answer, it may be a good piece to move forward on.
Well, kind of like the ALC has a broader mandate that they actually aren't able to.
Yeah.
True, but maybe you start in one place
Yes.
and move.
Yeah.
Like land linking is a really good way to connect with landowners, farmers who are retired, who have nobody to pass on their farm to, and start to build that relationship.
And that's happening. I think a lot of the networks and the community futures, the Farm for the City folk, are doing, agrarians are doing lots of land linking work. So the question is, how do you scale that up and out and have a provincial land base that can actually be linked to? So, yeah. I mean, the American Farmland Trust, for example, does a lot of things. It holds
Right.
some land, it holds a lot of agricultural covenants, it does a lot of education, does a lot of land linking, provides training and support for organizations or individuals who want to get into shared land relationships. So the model that I've been hearing the most about, and that people seem to be very responsive, is this broader model that you're talking about. It doesn't just hold the land, but it also has an entity that facilitates that land being put into production.
But then what's the relationship between that body and government responsibility? You know what I mean? Like, to me, that could still then be, this is now a charitably funded, super labor intensive mechanism that we can actually see state involvement, public policy for public good withdraw from. I don't know, to me there's still that tension of need to do it in strategy, but how do we do that in our
I
current?
think if the land, one option is that the land remains public.
Yeah.
So you have the public land, so it is in public interest, right? It is
Yes.
public good. It's
Yeah.
not owned by a nonprofit society.
Yeah.
A nonprofit society or an agency may
Yeah.
manage that land.
Right.
Mhm.
So the Halliburton is a good example there, where that land is owned by the municipality of Saanich. It has an access agreement with Halliburton Society, who in effect leases the land on a long-term basis, I think 99 years, from, maybe Marielle's can correct me if I'm wrong, from Saanich, and then does the land linking, does the education, does the outreach, manages the day-to-day operations. So Saanich doesn't have to actually bother with that, but it knows that the lease is written such that if Halliburton folds, then it's still public land, and it can be leased into another nonprofit society with a similar mandate.
Mary Alice here again.
Hi, Mary Alice.
It seems like one key is that community involvement. I watched Halliburton go together, and the reason why it did is that it had a community behind it. And I think the same is true with Madrona Farm, many of the farms. So I think rather than having a BC, a province-wide organization that is supposed to take care of this, I think having it is an umbrella of various community organizations that are working at the community level, that works farm by farm by farm. I mean, we know here in our area of a number of farms that are needing some support in transition, in acquisition, in succession, all of those. I mean, I've had 3 groups come to me in the last few weeks who are looking for land to purchase or to lease, and then I also know of 3 or 4 farmers who are concerned about their farms. So at the community level, people know what's going on, and also communities will support much more strongly a farm that's within their site. So I think having the building the community strength land trust might be a way to go.
Great. Yeah, maybe I just comment also on Brad's comment and back to that.
Yeah.
That's when I want to make it clear that in doing this work we support the ALR for that, partially for that reason, because we don't want government to say, oh, well, we're going to have a farmland trust being developed, so we can use that as a reason to reduce the impact of the ALR and the ALC or the power of it. So making that really clear that these models are meant to be
They're complementary. Yeah, I mean, that's
complementary to
right,
the ALR, that's the word, yeah. So I want to make that very clear, especially at this moment of time, and you aren't the first person to have to raise that concern, that as we develop this, especially at this critical moment with the politics around the ALR and ALC, that we need to make it very clear that this isn't meant to be a replacement for the ALR, it's meant to be in complement and collaboration with government and the ALR. And then back to Mary Alice's point about with the Farmland Trust, thanks for raising that again, Mary Alice, and that was raised by many of the people we spoke with when we had sort of a visioning session about Farmland Trusts. And I think that's if it were a provincial trust, the idea would be to have sort of this umbrella, larger institutional organization that could then support the smaller communities who are struggling to move their projects forward. And then the management would still be held by the community in terms of managing and decisions around the actual piece of land. Would be those who are using it, and the community is benefiting from it, not the provincial trust. So it's sort of like an umbrella that would collaborate with other organizations, farms, etc.
So we just have 5 minutes left, so maybe we'll take one more question from the webinar, from the web people, and then the last one from our in-house participants. So anybody on the web that has a question to close us out? Or a comment?
Hi, I have a question.
So that,
Can you hear me?
yeah, just go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Simon Haydock, and I'm from Kimberley, BC. I've been screen capturing this, and I was going to make a video to share with people that didn't get a chance to sit down and watch it, and just with your permission, if that's okay, if I can post it on a YouTube channel or something.
Sure, we're videoing it here too, so that's a good backup. If you send us the link, then we can also post this one too, and we'll see which one looks better. But thanks for that offer. That's great. I know we had been told we could take up to 50 webinar participants, but it turned out it was 25. So I think there's quite a few people that will want to see the video.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay,
you're welcome to share, but we'll also let's be in touch.
So
Okay, and thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, great. So questions from the table?
Sure, I have one actually. I've actually always been looking at it from the other side, like looking at it from the supply side, or sort of like the distribution side. So saying it's hard to actually get this locally into the system that we currently have. And I was surprised to see that profitability ranked 9th out of all of the determinants of all of the concerns people had. But I was wondering, do you think that's a reflection more of people not being farmers, like active farmers? Because certainly the majority of your sample were people that were not actively farming. So is that just kind of a romantic idea that the immediate barrier is land and the future barrier will probably be
It's also
income?
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Unless you have the land, can you worry about? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, like, is that something that if you were to actually just use your, like, a sample of people who were actively farming, does it change?
It actually does,
yeah.
and so that the list that I showed you was just the prospective respondents for
okay.
simplicity's sake of overwhelmingly large lists. And so that is a very good point, that profitability was better. And so with the sample that I had of people who were actually farming at the beginning, young farmer sample, the list was relatively similar, but that was one of the differences, is that profitability was ranked as higher up on the list as a barrier. So thank you for pointing that out. I just for time, and it is. There was 34 answers for the current farmers, so a little bit less, but
Yeah.
but in terms of what was considered to be a barrier, it was the same top two, the access to capital and cost of land. But then profitability was higher up in the list. And I think I noticed that too, because and it's raised by a lot of people I talk to, and I talk about land, they're like, well, why are you talking about profitability? Because that's the real issue. And so I tried to sort of make that connection. Hasn't been the main focus, but like as Hannah said, and as you said, many other people, it needs to be an integrated focus in anything, is the profitability on the land.
For sure. And I guess it's linked in the sense that if you're not carrying debt on your land or servicing that debt, then certainly your profitability will be enhanced because of that. So certainly it's included, but in a kind of convoluted way, I guess.
Yeah.
I also noticed that only 91% of current farmers hope to own land, whereas 100% of prospective do, which I also thought was kind of a
Of
funny
course,
example of like
yeah.
10% have gotten in and be like, never mind, I actually don't actually even hope to anymore.
Yeah.
Great. Well, on that note, thanks to everyone for your participation. Definitely do stay in touch. We'll be sending out the reports from this research as it evolves, and we will be making the link available to the slides and to the video. So
Yes, and you all have my email from the invite, so if you have any comments or questions that you didn't get to share, please feel free to send me an email.
great. Thanks.
Thank you.